Welcome back to another Addy Hour podcast episode. Today I'm really excited because I actually have someone physically here with me in the studio. That's a rare occurrence, but something that I think is going to be a lot of fun. And today I have the pleasure of hosting somebody that I've actually known about for a while, but only recently met. So it's been nice to be able to connect with him and really excited to host this conversation. We're going to be talking about faith, science, meaning, and purpose. And I know there's a lot that's in that, but I think you'll see why as we jump into the episode. So again, grateful that you all are here. Just want to acknowledge again that there is a lot that's going on in our world, and I just always want to make sure that people take time to pace themselves, to just take time to have that self-care, care for those in your lives, while still paying attention to these important things that are affecting a lot of us around the world. So I think it's always important to acknowledge that even as we jump into this conversation. And in some ways, I think the conversation today, especially as we talk about purpose and meaning, will tie in with some of those themes as well. But to jump in, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sam Wilkinson. Sam is an associate professor of psychiatry here at the Yale School of Medicine. He also serves as the associate director of the Yale Depression Research Program. He received his BS in mechanical engineering, summa cum laude, from Brigham Young University, BYU, and then later went on to medical school at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. He later completed his residency here at Yale and then joined the faculty doing his postgraduate training, and has continued on in his research and in his clinical practice. So his research focus primarily focuses on depression and suicide prevention. He's been funded by multiple different agencies, including the National Institutes of Health, also the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. His research and articles have been featured widely in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He's also received multiple numerous awards. But one of the things, in addition to all those things, that I'm really excited about is his forthcoming book, which will be released in 2024. It's called Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning and Purpose of Our Existence. So a lot that's there, something that I'm looking forward to reading. Just want to also mention that he has had various experiences before he arrived here at Yale. As a young man, served as on a mission for his church in Nevada from 2002 to 2004. Actually learned to speak fluent Spanish during that time and enjoy a variety of Latino cultures. He also served as a bishop for his local congregation from 2017 to 2023. I know that's something we'll dive into in the conversation as well. He lives in the state of Connecticut with his wife and 5 children, and I know he's an active family man as well, so that may come up in the conversation. As you all know, we always just see where these conversations go, and a lot that we can jump into today, but my pleasure to welcome Sam Wilkinson to the Addy Hour podcast.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you you having me on the show.
Of course. And as things often go with the size of our university, it's sometimes funny to me how often I meet people that I've been working close to for so many years. So I feel like that is the case for us as well, as I've heard your name in lots of different avenues and circles and circumstances. So great to be able to connect here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Of course. And as my listeners know, as you know as well, I always like to just start out with a check-in just to see how you're doing day to day with everything we're navigating in society and with everything that you're balancing isn't the right word, but juggling maybe with family life, work life, research, clinical. So anywhere you want to take us is completely fine.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me. I'm doing well, all things considered. Mm-hmm. It is a difficult time in the world. I think probably more than anything, my family relationships help keep me grounded. Mm. Certainly my wife keeps me grounded and humble, and my kids keep me humble. So trying to balance, juggle, as you say, lots of different responsibilities and wearing different hats, but for the most part, enjoying it and trying to overcome the struggles we inevitably all bump into.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
Thanks.
And perspective, and I don't know if you have the experience that I do of critiques depending on the age of the children, and even with this podcast, as we were developing things and thinking about different logos and pictures and things like that, the kids were willing critics, I'll just say. Dad, why are you doing that?
So. Well, they certainly keep me grounded. About a year ago, I was asked to give a talk to up-and-coming junior faculty about how to be successful in research. And I remember telling my family this the night before at the dinner table, and my son, one of my sons who was probably about 8 years old, said, well, I'm giving a talk tomorrow about how to be successful in research. And he looked at me and says, Dad, why are you giving that talk? You're not successful.
Did you ask him why his perception was that?
No,
Maybe elaborate a little bit.
He was joking, but it was a nice. It was a nice.
Oh my goodness.
They definitely keep you grounded and keep you from becoming and thinking that you're more than you actually are. You know.
Yeah.
Keep things put into perspective.
Yeah.
You know? So,
yeah. That's a great story. I'd be curious, even if he was joking in that scenario, to be like, well, what do you define as success, and how would you like to step into this for me? Which I have offered to my kids before. They have not taken me up on that yet, either with talks or with writing or anything like that. But.
Yeah, that would. I'm curious to imagine what direction that would take.
Yeah. So, well, that's great to hear. I mean, just to be able to keep things light like that and have that perspective and that appropriate jovial prodding, shall we call it.
Yep, exactly.
Other question I wanted to ask you, just as I've talked about some of your different roles, just to give our listeners a sense for what your day-to-day actually looks like, clinically, research-wise, and even with the book coming up. And then if you want even to go into like how you attempt to juggle family and work and all that.
Yeah, so I spend most of my time doing research, doing clinical research, so in the form of clinical trials, and there's a good amount of my time that is in administration and leading those efforts, coordinating among the various people who are in our research group, coordinating the research visits, certainly writing papers, writing grants. So writing is a big part of what I do, trying to mentor the up-and-coming generation, people who are preparing to go to medical school or graduate school. And then I also see patients. So a small part of my time is patient care outside of research protocols. And that is, I think that is something that I think is important in clinical research because it keeps you, again, along this theme of keeping you grounded. It keeps you in touch with what are the patients, what are they struggling with? What do they care about? What are the topics and the research questions that we could ask that would be most meaningful for them?
Do you feel like, and you're hinting at that actually informs the research that you're doing? Has
Very
it
much
ever
so.
Shifted things based on questions you're asking or how you're approaching things?
Very much so. Certainly being in the clinic, I think, helps tremendously to know there's a bit of a gap between research and clinical endeavors in psychiatry. And I think to help bring that gap closer together, it's important to have research questions that are informed by what are the big problems clinically.
Right.
And there are lots of them.
Yeah.
But I think having a foot in the clinic, for me at least, is very helpful to keep my research relevant.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good to hear. And I'm sure people are encouraged to hear that as well. I'm also imagining, so people who are in academic settings or physicians or scientists who are hearing this might have a sense of what the clinical research looks like. But I also imagine people who are outside of those spheres who sometimes hear about research often wonder, like, how much are things actually moving forward? So people hear, well, there's this clinical research here, this clinical research here, but I'm still struggling or my family member is still struggling, and especially around things like depression, suicidal ideation. Oftentimes people are wondering, are things actually moving forward and becoming more effective? Do we actually understand what's happening in the brain, what's contributing to all these things? I know those are some of the conversations we've had on this podcast before, but I'm just curious from your perspective, speaking with those who are seeing things from the outside, like what would you say in terms of how you see the research actually moving things forward? Are we making practical steps, I guess is another way to ask that question.
Yeah, that's a really great question. There's lots of nuances to it. I think I am optimistic at this point. There's still a lot that we don't understand. The what's called the brain-mind gap is quite formidable as a research question, but it's an exciting time from a researcher to be in clinical depression research. There's all sorts of things that are either newly approved and now standard therapies, things coming in the pipeline that will very likely be approved soon, new ways of thinking about how to treat depression. So a couple of years ago, the FDA approved what they framed as the first rapid acting antidepressant. It's approved for treatment-resistant depression. It's also approved for depression with suicidal ideation. Earlier this year, the first pill oral antidepressant was approved for postpartum depression. there's a resurgence in interest in what's called psychedelics. And it's complicated, and I think we need to approach this in a way that is careful and where we put safety paramount in importance and priority. But there's a lot of really promising clinical trial data that has come out, and certainly a lot of things in the pipeline. Another area that I'm excited about is something called digital therapeutics, which is they're essentially apps that people have on their phones or computers, and they try to help people learn and integrate principles of psychotherapy.
Okay.
One of the reasons I'm excited about this is because up until this point, the amount of funding that was devoted to developing psychotherapy and similar approaches has been very, very, very small compared to the amount of funding that has been devoted to the development of drugs and pharmaceuticals.
Right.
And certainly there are many cases where drugs and pharmaceuticals are helpful, but most of us in this field recognize that these problems are very complicated, and a single approach of just one drug, there's not going to be a miracle drug that's going to help people just solve all their social problems and that sort of thing, which are often weigh heavy in the development of psychiatric illness. So it's not exactly the same thing as psychotherapy, but it has the potential, I think, to draw in quite a bit of funding from industry to, and it has a way to standardize these therapies in ways that up until this point we haven't been able to do. So there's a lot of things that, at least as a researcher, I'm very excited about, and I think there are some real breakthroughs that have happened recently and will happen in the short term.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear. I mean, even for listeners, as you've described some of those changes, some of those new approvals, but then even as you're talking about some of the funding pieces, because as you've mentioned, others who've come on the podcast, Jerry Sanacoro, who you work with pretty regularly, and just the importance of combining. So as people have often said in media spaces, it's important, even with the ketamine, to combine that with therapy, but to know that things can actually move in that direction from a funding standpoint, I think is really, really important and really encouraging.
Yeah, it is. It is very exciting. There's a lot going on.
That's great. Well, not to pivot too quickly, because I know this is just one part of what you do. And I also want to, tie in this idea of the book that's coming out, because I'm curious, how that process came about. I'm sure as people are looking at the title of this episode and just thinking about all those pieces that are wrapped into. So maybe you can take us on a little bit of a journey about why a book on that topic when you obviously have a lot to keep you busy with your day job that's already impactful and making a lot of inroads in a lot of ways. Yeah.
So the idea of writing a book, I got this as a medical student. It's been a long time, and for about 10 years I put it on the shelf, but was able to pick it back up again really right before the pandemic started. But this idea came shortly after I started medical school. I grew up in a religious home, religious tradition. For the most part, there was a bit of rebellion in my teenage years, but for the most part, really latched onto this. I bought into it, and for whatever reason, it wasn't until I got to medical school. I went to medical school in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins. It was a great experience. There were lots of wonderful mentors, friends that my wife and I met there and had great relationships with. But at the beginning of it, my soul, if you will, was in turmoil, and I was trying to figure out I was bothered by the perception of a conflict between science and religion. And I didn't really confront this earlier in my life, in my undergraduate education, for whatever reason. And I confronted it in medical school for the first time. And there was a period of several months where I felt very uncomfortable. And I was wrestling with, well, is there actually a God? Are we just products of random chance? Are we intricate molecular accidents? Is there really no purpose to our existence? Is it just happenstance that we're here? And I went through a period of intense study and reflection, meditation and prayer. And I don't know how else to describe it other than I had a sort of epiphany, a spiritual and intellectual epiphany. And there's certainly a lot still that I don't understand, a lot of questions that I still have. But what I've learned since that time has been incredibly satisfying, both from a spiritual and an intellectual perspective, to help these worldviews, these spiritual and academic worldview come a little closer together.
Wow, I'm just kind of taking it all in as you're sharing that story, because that's pretty powerful to hear you describe that, and then also the journey that you went on.
Yeah.
I mean, one question that comes up in my mind that others may also be curious about is, so I mean, you had this shift in your perspective and this epiphany. I'm wondering if that changed your interactions with folks or how folks perceived you, or if this felt more kind of as a personal journey as you were going through medical school and beyond.
I think mostly it was a personal journey, but it certainly has helped me to prioritize where I spend my effort and my time. And one of the what I think is a really critical lesson that I gleaned from this experience was the importance of relationships. And there's so much data that I've learned and read and studied since, how important relationships are in our happiness and well-being, mentally, physically. And we often forget that because our brains seem to be wired in such a way that psychologists call it affective forecasting. We're not very good at predicting how we're going to be feeling in a given situation. And as a consequence, we're not very good at predicting what is going to make us happy. And so I keep needing to remind myself, come on, dummy, it's the relationship. Don't spend too much time on your grants. You're home, be at home, be engaged with your kids and your wife and so forth. So that has been one of the powerful lessons that I have gleaned from this experience and the studying and research that I've done related to it.
That's really good. I mean, I'm even thinking about that, not being able to predict the happiness. I'm speculating that I think we know what will actually give us happiness.
Yeah.
And that, I don't know if that's part of what's come up in that conversation from the psychological perspective, but.
Sure. So you can think of it a little bit as almost a cognitive illusion, right?
Okay.
We think we know what's going to make us happy, and then we get there, and it's like this doesn't quite feel as good as we think it would. Sometimes this is referred to as the Honic Treadmill. So there's a famous study, I think it was the 1970s. It examined two very different groups of people. One was a group of people who had won the lottery.
Okay.
And the other was a group of people who had suffered terrible accidents and become paraplegic and lost the use of some of their limbs.
Okay.
And so, when you ask people what would you rather be, someone who wins the lottery or someone who suffers a terrible accident and loses the use of their legs, of course people say, well, of course, and they examined these two groups, and this was some period of time after these incidents had happened, and there wasn't really much of a difference between them in their levels of kind of day-to-day well-being, what they enjoyed, and so forth. That's sometimes referred to as the hedonic treadmill in psychology, where we think, oh, if I just get this promotion or I get a raise, I just need 20% raise, then I'll be happy and content. And you get that, and for a little bit of time you feel better, but it goes back to the set point. And there's so many things that fall into this category. One of the big exceptions is relationships, both for better and for worse.
Okay.
So a good, warm relationship really seems to raise your kind of happiness and well-being set point, and a toxic relationship brings it down.
Yeah.
And even on those days where you don't see a person who you're in conflict with, you are often still ruminating about it, and it's taking a toll psychologically on your happiness and well-being. So there's just lots of really interesting research suggesting that we have these cognitive illusions. We think, oh, if I just win the lottery, right? And you might feel better for a couple months. But then you go back to the set point. Especially if that wealth and that money, it gets in the way of relationships. That's a bad thing for your happiness. So again, this journey that I've kind of gone on to prepare research for and write this book has really just underscored to me the critical importance of spending time cultivating and strengthening personal relationships.
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, as you're talking, I can hear the time that you've put in to doing that research, but how impactful it's been as well. And it seems like that whole importance of relationship and community can't be overstressed, Because even as you're talking about it, I'm thinking of people who said that over and over again. I mean, even some of the guests on this podcast who have reached, high status in terms of social clout and all that, who say the same thing, which they had already heard, but it's almost as if, people have heard it, but it doesn't always sink in until we've experienced it. And so I'm curious if you feel like hopefully in this book, you'll be able to help some people get to that place before, because obviously not everybody can experience that, reaching whatever height they felt like was going to be that penultimate, and then be like, okay, it's still not enough.
Correct. And I think we need to be continually reminded of it, the importance of relationships. So this is one of the reasons that I think it's important, for me at least, to go to church. Is that, a big part of my church experience, and I'm a Christian, so the fundamental commandment is to love God and to love your neighbor, and that is, it's essentially telling you the relationships are important. And so again, I think because of the way that our psychologies are structured, we need to continually be reminded of this. Because for me at least, if I forget about this for a little bit, I'll go back to, okay, I'm focused on grant writing, on writing my publications, whatever it is. I want to achieve some status. That feels good. But there's a superficial type of good that pales in comparison to the profound meaning and happiness and well-being that comes from a warm and loving relationship with a spouse, a child, a sibling, a friend. So I think we need to keep reminding ourselves, because it seems like we're not wired to remember it. There's a saying in my faith that faith has a short shelf life, and kind of analogous to this, the understanding that relationships are really important also has a short shelf life, and you need to keep pulling out that book and remembering it's the relationship. So.
Yeah, that's really good. That was actually going to be my next question, even in terms of the faith community church part, how much you feel like that has not only just informed your work, but just your experience and as you've tried to remember these pieces. But I think it's also interesting how you mentioned the two ways that community can go. Because even yesterday I was having a conversation with a lot of clergy within the state of Indiana through an organization they have, and talking about these aspects of community. And someone made the comments / question about that very piece. Sometimes community is a thing that actually helps people in navigating whatever emotional wellness challenges they have, but it can also be the cause of the challenges or make things worse. So how do you see that all fitting into this? Not that that's an easy question, but
how to create a utopia, you're basically asking. Is that right? Do I got the question right? It's something with which we all struggle. I don't have a magic answer. I think a big part of it comes back to the individual relationships. This question of how to build a better community, it's tricky. It's very tricky, and I think a lot of us have a sense of what a good community would look like. It would value principles of justice and inclusion and belonging, also fairness, and the opportunity for people to rise if they came from an impoverished background, the opportunity for them to rise to a higher standing and status. The problem is that we wrestle with how to prioritize these issues, and that is one of the reasons why there's polarization. That's one of the political dialogues that goes in, is what is the more important issue. And certainly I'm of the opinion that we need to tone down our political discourse and try to have civil disagreements. But there's another aspect that I think, and I do refer to this somewhat in my book. One of the impediments to building a better community is that there's an aspect to our nature that is not good, that is selfish, that can be mean-spirited, can be cruel, can be aggressive, and so on and so forth. There, unfortunately, that is a capacity of human beings. I think it's hard to look far into the history of humanity and not see examples of that, of where things have gone wrong. So maybe a different way to ask the question is, how can we help people voluntarily choose to be better? Because even if we can't agree on exactly what a good society looks like in terms of ordering those principles, I think the vast majority of people would agree that if we can get people to behave better, building the good society, whatever that is going to be easier.
Yeah. That's really insightful. I mean, you're piquing my curiosity about the book too, and the ways that you're bringing that in. I mean, but just to think about, I mean, obviously the book's not out yet, haven't read it, but I'm thinking it almost sounds like there's so many topics that you've integrated, because you've talked about the faith and science piece. I mean, even in the subtitle, evolution and human nature.
Yeah.
How does that all wrap into this idea and some of these concepts that you've been talking about?
Yeah, and you do note it is a very broad book. It was a lot of fun to write. It was challenging in many ways. There are a lot of kind of fairly big topics that I try to address. I can't, I could write a whole book on each chapter, and maybe I'll do that if this one goes well and if my wife lets me. But so I alluded to this part of our nature that is not good. So let me go back just a little bit with this struggle that I had when I was a medical student. One of the big things that bothered me in this faith and science conflict that I perceived, and a lot of times I think when we say the conflict between faith and science, a lot of it comes down to evolution, the theory of evolution, right? That is a big kind of, it hasn't necessarily intentionally been that way, but it's been a big wedge in a lot of people. And a lot of people of faith, it's been a stumbling block. How does this fit in? One of the issues that bothered me was what evolution implied about human nature. And, there's a quote of a woman. This is most likely didn't happen, but around the time that Darwin first came out with his initial book, in 1859, The Origin of Species, there's a woman who, upon first hearing of the theory of evolution, exclaimed, "My dear, let us hope that it is not true. But if it is true, let us hope that it does not become widely known." And kind of this sense of, what it implies about human nature is terrible. Is this survival of the fittest? So are we really at our core selfish and greedy and aggressive and all these other things that initially we think that's not good. So this was one of the key dilemmas for me. So what does evolution really state about human nature? And it turns out that it's complex. And, certainly we have a capacity for selfishness, but we also have a great capacity for altruism and cooperation. And there are lots of different theories and evolutionary mechanisms that scientists think are responsible for this. And I can go into some of those in detail. But what it appears to me, and I'm not the first one to observe this, but it appears that evolution has left us in this state of tension. We have a capacity for selfishness, but also altruism. We have a capacity for aggression, but also cooperation, cruelty, but also kindness. And when you combine that with the empirical observation that we have at least some level of freedom to choose, free will, to me it seems that life is a test, that we have good and evil inherent within us, and we have the freedom to choose, and it seems like life is a test. That is part of what I would consider, and I know this sounds grandiose, but I do think there's truth to it, that is part of the universal purpose to our existence, is to choose, to develop our ability to choose between good and evil. And it's almost written within our DNA, so to speak.
Wow. You said a lot. I'm trying to decide where to go next. There's so many different things and that's why it's good that you have the book, because people will be able to delve in and unpack. Rather than actually unpacking any of those specific pieces, I'm curious, and this is just going to be a little bit of a speculation on your part, but how you think, or maybe how you hope, that people will respond to the book with all those, even in that, that one response you had with all different pieces that you've put in there. Like, how do you think this will land with people? Maybe that's not a fair question. I know.
It's a good question. It's a complicated question. Of course, it depends on the person.
Yeah.
I mainly wrote this for people who have some religious belief or some faith belief in a higher power or a higher purpose to our existence, and are not sure how that squares with the most up-to-date advances in science and understanding of ourselves and the universe with science. So I don't expect this to I mean, it would be great, in my opinion, it would be great if it really caused, a lot of people to say, oh, I now believe in God because I read your book, Sam. I don't necessarily expect that to happen. There's a quote that I like. I believe it's attributed to a man named Austin Farrar, who was a contemporary and friend of C.S. Lewis, who basically said, argument cannot create faith, but the lack of argument can destroy faith.
Wow.
So I don't think that I can rationally necessarily persuade people to believe. I think for most people that comes through personal experiences, through prayer, through perhaps some miracle or miraculous experience that they've encountered. But if you don't educate people and give them a rational framework where their faith can be defended against, argument from, there's a lot of, maybe not so much anymore in the early 2000s. There were the four atheists that, I can't remember how it was phrased, but a lot of people saying, look, this is a relic of the past. We need to do away with this. This is harmful for society. I disagree with that. And part of my book is to provide people of faith an understanding of the most up-to-date science of human nature and evolution, and provide them with a way that they can rationally reconcile their beliefs in a God and a higher purpose for existence with science.
Yeah. And I think that's really powerful because oftentimes, I mean, similar to some of the topics that we've talked about on this podcast, that's a question that a lot of people are thinking about or wondering about, but don't always have the space to discuss or read about more globally. So I feel like, you have a sense of what you're trying to do, the audience you're trying to reach. And again, it could be a broader audience, but I think that'll be very helpful and very informative for a lot of people. Do you see it facilitating discussions as well? Or conversation?
I hope it does. Certainly what you just mentioned, that was a very core part of my experience that led me to write this book, is this wrestle I had and this kind of internal discussion I had, along with the studying of the literature and the research and so forth. I hope it stimulates discussion. I do think these issues need to be discussed. I think in a sort of response to some of the academics who are saying that, look, religion should be done away with, God is a myth, and we've outgrown it as humanity. There seems to be very much this. Sometimes people refer to it as a God-shaped hole in the human heart, and there's this very natural tendency to believe in God. I don't think that's going anywhere. I think I do think the way that human nature is that the atheists are fighting a losing battle in convincing all of humanity not to believe in God. That's not necessarily an argument for, oh, this must be that there is God. Right. I think there may be some argument for it. But I do think faith is going to be with us in some form. These days, people tend to seem to prefer to say that they're spiritual, not necessarily religious. I think there is value in organized religion. It's tricky because anytime you have an organization, there can be abuses of power and so forth. But I think there is great good that can be done and has been done in the name of faith. Certainly not to say that there hasn't been abuses and so forth, and those need to be rooted out. We need to do everything we can to do away with those. But I think for many people, it is a powerful source of good and of meaning and of purpose.
Yeah, really well said. And I think truth to that, and then just even ways that people are, I don't know if reconcile is the right word, but reconciling the fact that faith is here and, like you said, is going to be around for a while.
I think it's here to stay in some form. I really do. There seems to be, again, what some academics call this God-shaped hole in the human heart, and this need to believe.
Yeah. So I'm curious, because it seems like that appreciation that you've had has maybe come over time, over the years, a little bit removed from when you were wrestling through all the things as a medical student. I'm curious if you, from your perspective, even before this book comes out, if you've seen changes in receptivity to faith conversations, either in your clinical work, academic, research-wise, or do you feel like things have been the same?
No, I think, and you and I talked about this at one point, maybe a few months ago. there was this perception that I had
Mm-hmm.
that most people who surrounded me in academics did not want to talk about faith or did not have any sort of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience is that that's more perceived than real.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a lot of people who believe and would be welcome to, of course, this needs to be discussed in a way that is respectful and not coercive and so forth. But there are a lot of people who are open, at least to a brief discussion and acknowledgement. Yeah, how was your weekend? Well, it was great. I had this great experience at church, and the lesson was great, and so forth. As I have, and there may be a little bit of confounding here because I've with time, I have, quote unquote, climbed the ladder and
Right.
I have a little bit more authority than I used to. But I do think that there's truth that there are a lot of people who are more than willing to engage and discuss and think about these issues, of course, done respectfully, than maybe is perceived in an academic environment.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with you. I know we had that conversation before too, but I keep saying I keep getting surprised at how open people are to those conversations.
And some people are not, and some people it's very, some people seem a bit averse to this, and of course I want to respect. I'm not going to stand on the soapbox and preach to them in the workplace. I don't think that's appropriate if people don't want to hear it. You need to be respectful of that. But if people do, then I think it's okay to be open about it.
Yeah. And I think refreshing in the sense that people have been, at least in my experience, more open to just thinking about this from an inclusive standpoint too, of hearing different people's perspectives, including their faith perspectives, and not just diminishing people and saying, "Oh, we're not going to talk about that here. We're not going to create room for that." So I think I'm curious. There's no answer to this per se, or there is, but I'm curious. Just as your book is coming out in that shift, as it were, I don't have research evidence for it, but just anecdotally, to how people will be able to think about that. I mean, even anecdotally, again, being able to talk about my own faith perspective with research and with life in an interview with Nature Neuroscience. I would not have imagined that 10 years ago. Now, which
I think is a great thing.
Yeah, to be able to have that
I respect
space.
you, and I look up to you a lot for that. And I think it's been a great dialogue that you've been able with this podcast and the venues that you have for speaking about it. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think, for me, it would almost be disingenuous to say, no, this is a part of me that I can't talk about at work or I can't bring to work in any sort of form. Again, I want to be respectful of other people's opinions and viewpoints, but this is a big part of who I am.
Yeah.
And to say, I just got to leave that at home, to me, that's a little disingenuous.
Yeah.
Again, it has to be done carefully and respectfully.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I should give context for those who are not reading academic journals, since that's a small group of us. But Nature Neuroscience is a respected journal in our field, and very high level work that's put there. So to have that opportunity was a huge blessing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's great.
The other piece that I'm curious about, because this was in your bio as well, and I'm asking this a little bit selfishly, but about your role as a bishop in your local congregation, as you're doing your work as a psychiatrist and a researcher. And I know you talked about giving sermons before too, and so what that experience has been like for you. And I'll tell listeners selfishly, I'm mentioning that because I have been asked to give more sermons more recently as a neuroscientist to integrate the science, the faith perspective. And so it's always, I can tell when I stand in front of the congregation, it always feels a little bit different. I always at least try and break the ice and say, they probably never listened to a sermon from a neuroscientist, but apparently people have listened to sermons from a psychiatrist and what you've done. So anything you want to share just about what that experience has been like for you?
Yeah, that was a very formative experience. So I was asked to be a bishop not long after I joined the faculty.
Okay.
And so it was it is a fairly substantial time commitment. I would estimate that on a given week, it was roughly 15 hours of work.
Okay.
And when you serve in this role, in my community at least, people do not see you as a psychiatrist first and also bishop. They see you as you are the bishop, you are the person who is asked to be our congregation's bishop. And so I see you as a bishop. Oh, you happen to be a psychiatrist? Oh, that's interesting. But the way it is done in my faith is that we don't have professional clergy. So any person is asked to serve in sort of a leadership role or a non-leadership role to help, help with the clerical duties and so forth. And we got to print the programs, that sort of thing, set up chairs before an activity. So for me, again, I was asked to be a bishop right as I joined the faculty. So it's kind of an intense time. Yeah. Also, a lot of young kids, and so there's a lot of juggling, of priorities and schedules and so forth. But it was really transformative, and it was something I loved. It was also hard. Anyone who has raised children might say, "Oh, that sounds familiar," right? It was very rewarding, but also very hard. Spent a lot of hours thinking about people in my congregation and their problems and how we could best help and support them. Had a lot of opportunities to speak publicly. It's not something where the bishop speaks every Sunday. Okay. I would speak maybe every 2 or 3 months. The way we do it, anyone could be asked. So you go to our congregation. So next week the bishop might pull you aside and say, "Hey, do you mind prepping some talk, some sermon for next week's church meeting?" So I learned a lot in my time in that role. I grew a lot. I stretched a lot. There were a lot of one of the ways I learned was what drives people, how to help people, how to align people's intrinsic interests with what needs to get done. And one of the challenges, unlike in a lot of other organizations, is that no one's paid. And so I can't be like, "Well, I'm going to cut your salary." Right. Oh, wait, your salary is already zero.
Can't do much there.
It's all positive reinforcement. It's always, "I'm so grateful. We asked you to do this. You only did half of that, but thank you anyway." It was, you took time out of your family life to do that. I'm extremely grateful. So that was an experiential learning process that I could not have learned any other way except through going through it. So it taught me a lot about human nature, taught me a lot about ways to organize things and people, and I think more than anything, it taught me that pretty much everyone has struggles, has difficulty, and that when you look at someone and you disagree with their politics, you disagree with whatever it is, you need to see them first as a person and say, "You know what, there's probably something that they're struggling with that I don't know about," and to be a little bit charitable in your first impression or first encounter with them.
That's such a healthy perspective. And I imagine that's also impacted your work too. I mean, you didn't say that explicitly, but like how you took those experiences and how you even operate, navigate in the clinical setting, in academic settings, in research settings.
Well, certainly as I've tried to help lead a research group with employees, and when for whatever reason some task is not getting done, is instead of the first inclination of "what the heck are you doing?" Shame on you, but sit down. "Hey, how's it going? How's your life? What's going on?" And a lot of times it's, "Oh, you know what? I'm really struggling with this family relationship. My uncle, who's an alcoholic, is struggling in this way or that way," and helping people, even if they just know that you care, you cared enough to listen. That helps quite a bit in forming a cohesive group that is trying to accomplish a cooperative task.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, it just goes back to that concept you mentioned at the beginning too about community. And relationship. And how important that is, and the ways you're able to do that as a bishop. It's also maybe endearing but humorous to think about the ways those lessons pop up in so many different spaces too. Even as you were talking, I remember years back, I shouldn't say years because that's going to make me feel older, but playing in a 30-plus basketball league. So if I say years, that means I've been over 30 for a while, which is somewhat true. But actually hearing some of the folks in that league, probably some folks who are close to maybe 60 or so, sharing that same perspective, saying like, you never know how someone walks in the door. And if they're acting out on the court, there might be something going on in their lives. And just even on the court, creating that space for people to actually have that room to kind of chat with folks on the side. So obviously the basketball court is not a congregation per se, but to think about those principles and how important they are and how they apply to so many different aspects. I would put a little bit more weight in the way that you did that as a bishop, but it was just interesting to hear that, to hear that same comment in different spheres and different circles. And to know, like you said for your book, how important that is just for our human flourishing in so many ways. So
my judgment and my experience is that most people are good. Most people want to do what's right. Sometimes, a lot of times, when people act out, it's because they're hurting, and it doesn't excuse things, and there need to, often be consequences for bad behavior. But there also needs to be an understanding of what is the root of this, and some love and compassion and caring, because external constraints on behavior aren't as powerful as if you can align intrinsic desires of people to behave in the right ways.
Yeah, that's really good, and I feel like it's tying into your passion and your motivation just in your day-to-day. Your day-to-day cadence, your day-to-day navigation, your day-to-day thriving as well. So would you say there's one thing that drives you, or there are multiple, if you were to summarize?
One thing that drives a lot of things. I mean, certainly at the core of it is my family and my family relationships and my identity as a father and a husband are crucial to me. And certainly I would not be, I guess some people might consider me successful. I wouldn't have been able to do nearly what I've been done without the love and support and companionship of my wife, who has just been really instrumental to me in developing as a person, as a professional, and serving in my faith community and so forth. So that's a big part of my identity. And then again, my belief in a higher power and a higher purpose to our existence is a big driving force to me. But again, you sometimes lose that in the day-to-day. And you need to be reminded, which again, for me, is one of the reasons it's important for me to go to church regularly and be reminded of these things. Okay, it's a relationship, stupid. You need to, not spend so much time doing this. That sort of thing.
Yeah. Because like you said, it's attention.
It is attention.
Yeah. So to have those continue. Because you'll definitely get the other reminders often and frequently from yourself and from those around you.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I welcome them most of the time. They're good for me, even on those days that I'm cranky and don't welcome them. But,
that's true.
They're very important.
That's true. So another question, just to kind of wrap up, and a word of encouragement for listeners too. What gives you hope? And you've alluded to this already a little bit, but on a day-to-day basis, just big picture-wise.
My hope is in the positive potential of human nature and the love and the warmth that I have experienced in personal relationships. Again, there's a lot of difficulty. There's a lot of problems in the world. I'm not trying to be naive to that, but I do believe that people are basically good and that they want to do what is right. Now, certainly there are exceptions, and we need to deal with those exceptions and do our best to contain them and so forth. But most people, they want to be happy, and they want to, even if they don't always consciously realize this, they want to have good relationships. And helping people realize that, educate them, and what is the type of life that will lead you to be most likely to develop those good relationships. I think we have not done a good job for that for our young people. So I don't mean to put a negative spin on that, but my hope is that with better education, better enlightenment, young people are struggling with a lot of challenges right now, but I think that there is a lot of hope for them.
Well said. And I appreciate you bringing the reality and attention to those too, in ways that we can improve. Again, this has been a great conversation. I'm definitely looking forward to reading through the book. Just to remind listeners, it's called Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning and Purpose of Our Existence. Sam, definitely appreciate you being here on the podcast. Looking forward to more conversations, formally and informally, and I know that listeners will get a lot out of this conversation as well.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Of course.